I still remember the weight of that silence, the kind that presses against your chest until you can't tell if you're breathing or just pretending to. I stood in my own kitchen, wearing the dress I'd ironed that morning with such care, staring at the cake I'd baked myself, because I wanted this one day to feel special. 56 candles I didn't light. 56 years of life, and on this particular birthday, I learned that love, real, sacrificial, bone-deep love, can be invisible to the person you gave everything to create it for. My son David stood across from me, his jaw tight, his eyes carrying something I'd never seen before. Not just anger. Anger I could have handled. I'd weathered his teenage moods, his college stress, his quarter-life crisis when he couldn't decide between law school and business. But this was different. This was contempt, cold and sharp and aimed directly at the woman who'd held him through every fever, every heartbreak, every 3 a.m. panic about exams or girls or the future. I wish you weren't my mother. 6 words. That's all it took to dismantle 25 years of sacrifice, of choosing his needs over mine, of working doubles at the diner and then night shifts at the hospital just to keep him in good schools, in clean clothes, in a home that felt safe even when the world outside our door was anything but. I didn't cry. Not then. I just stood there with my hands still holding the cake knife, feeling something inside me crack so quietly that I wondered if he even noticed. The cake was chocolate, his favorite since he was 7 years old. I'd remembered. I always remembered. But he'd forgotten mine. Not just the cake. Me. He'd forgotten me. David, I whispered, and I hated how my voice shook. What are you saying? He wouldn't look at me directly. His eyes darted to the window, to the refrigerator covered in his childhood drawings I'd never taken down, to anywhere but my face. You wouldn't understand. You never do. Never do. As if I hadn't spent decades learning to understand him. As if I hadn't taught myself his silences, his sighs, the way his shoulders tensed when something was wrong, even when he insisted everything was fine. I'd become fluent in my son, and now he stood in my kitchen telling me I spoke a language he'd never heard. The argument had started small, the way forest fires begin with a single spark you don't notice until everything's already burning. He'd shown up an hour late to his own birthday dinner for me. I'd made his favorites: pot roast, mashed potatoes, the green beans with almonds he'd always loved. The table was set with the good plates, the ones I saved for special occasions because they'd been my mother's, and they reminded me that some things are worth preserving. When he finally walked through that door, he didn't apologize. He just glanced at the table with this look, this tired, almost disgusted look, and said, "Mom, I told you not to make a big deal about this." Except he hadn't. He hadn't told me anything because we'd barely spoken in 3 weeks. He'd been too busy, he'd said. Work was demanding. His girlfriend needed attention. Life was complicated. I understood. I always understood. That was my role, wasn't it? To understand, to accommodate, to shrink myself small enough to fit into whatever space he had left over after everyone and everything else had taken their piece. But today was my birthday. Just mine. And I'd thought maybe, just maybe, he'd remember that I existed outside of what I could do for him. I just wanted us to have dinner together, I said quietly, my hands smoothing the tablecloth that didn't need smoothing. It's been so long since we just sat and talked. That's the problem, Mom. His voice had an edge to it, sharp enough to draw blood. You make everything about you. Your feelings, your needs, your expectations. Did you ever think that maybe I have my own life? That maybe I don't want to spend my Saturday night eating pot roast and pretending everything's perfect when it's not? The words hit like slaps, each one landing with precision on parts of me I thought were protected. I'd raised him alone. His father, God, his father was a story I'd buried so deep I sometimes forgot it was there. A man who'd promised forever and delivered 3 years before disappearing like smoke, leaving me with a toddler and a mortgage and dreams that suddenly seemed selfish compared to the immediate need to survive. I never told David the whole truth about his father. How could I? How do you explain to a child that the man who gave him life didn't think either of you were worth staying for? So I built a different story, one where his father was simply gone, simply absent, not actively choosing to abandon us. I thought I was protecting him, Now I wondered if I'd just been protecting myself. If you like stories that touch the heart, stories about real people facing real pain, please subscribe to this channel. We're working toward 1,000 subscribers, and your support means everything. Comment below and tell me what city you're watching from. Your voice matters here. David, I'm not trying to make anything about me, I said, and I could hear the pleading creeping into my voice. I hated that sound. The sound of a woman begging her own child to see her. I just miss you. I miss talking to you. You miss the version of me that needed you. He cut me off. The kid who couldn't do anything without you hovering. But I'm not that person anymore, Mom. I grew up. Maybe you should too. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the refrigerator humming, the clock on the wall ticking away seconds that suddenly felt too heavy to carry. I looked at my son, this man I'd raised, this person I'd shaped with every choice I'd made for 25 years, and I didn't recognize him. Or maybe I did, and that was worse. Maybe I saw exactly who I'd created, someone who'd learned that love was something you took, not something you returned. I worked 2 jobs for you, I said, and my voice was barely above a whisper. I gave up my nursing degree when you were 3 because the hours were too much and I needed to be home with you. I never dated, never remarried, never put anyone before you. Everything I did, every choice I made, was for you. I didn't ask you to do that. His voice rose, filling the kitchen with a kind of anger I'd never heard from him before. I didn't ask you to sacrifice everything and then hold it over my head like I owe you my entire life because of it. You made those choices, Mom. You, not me. And there it was. The thing I'd never wanted to face. The possibility that all those years of sacrifice, all those nights I'd fallen into bed too exhausted to dream, all those moments I'd put myself last because he came first, maybe they'd never been appreciated at all. Maybe they'd just been expected. Or worse, resented. The cake sat between us on the counter, chocolate frosting starting to lose its shape in the warm kitchen. I'd piped "Happy Birthday" in careful letters, my hand steady even though I'd been up since 5 a.m. for my shift at the hospital. I'd used the money I'd saved from skipping lunch all week to buy the good cocoa, the real vanilla extract, the expensive butter that made everything taste the way childhood memories should taste. You should go, I heard myself say. The words came from somewhere deep, somewhere I didn't recognize, somewhere that was finally tired. He looked at me then, really looked, and for just a second I thought I saw something flicker across his face. Regret, maybe. Or recognition of the line we'd just crossed. But then his jaw set again, and he grabbed his jacket from the back of the chair. Fine, I'll go. And maybe while I'm gone, you can think about why everyone in your life eventually walks away. The door closed behind him with a soft click. Not a slam. Somehow that was worse. A slam would have meant emotion, passion, something that could be repaired. But that quiet click? That was finality. That was a door closing not just on tonight, but on something much bigger than a birthday dinner gone wrong. I stood alone in my kitchen, surrounded by food no one would eat, wearing a dress no one had noticed, holding a knife over a cake no one wanted, and for the first time in 56 years, I let myself wonder if maybe, just maybe, I'd spent my whole life loving people who'd never learned how to love me back. The first week after David left, I kept expecting him to call, not to apologize. I'd learned long ago not to expect apologies from him, but just to check in, to let me know he was okay, to maybe ask if I was okay. The phone stayed silent. I checked it obsessively anyway, the way you check a wound to see if it's still bleeding even though you know it is. I went to work at the hospital like nothing had happened. What else was I supposed to do? Call in sick because my heart was broken? Tell my supervisor that I couldn't take vitals or change IV bags because my son had finally said out loud what I'd been afraid to see in his eyes for months. So I smiled at patients. I comforted families. I did my job with the same steady competence I'd built my entire life around. And when I came home to that empty house, I sat in the silence and felt myself becoming smaller. My neighbor, Patricia, caught me taking out the trash on Thursday evening. She's one of those women who notices everything but pretends she doesn't, who asks how you're doing with eyes that say she already knows the answer. We'd lived next door to each other for 17 years. She'd watched David grow up, had given him cookies when he'd mowed her lawn as a teenager, had waved at us from her porch on Sunday mornings when we'd left for church. "Alice, honey," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone of concern that makes you want to either cry or run. "I haven't seen David's car around. Everything all right?" I forced a smile. I'd become so good at forced smiles over the years that they felt more natural than real ones. "Oh, you know how it is. He's busy with work. Young people always are." She looked at me for a long moment, her eyes searching my face for the truth I wasn't giving her. "Well, if you need anything, you know where I am." But I didn't need anything from Patricia, did I? I'd spent 25 years not needing anything from anyone except the strength to get through one more day, one more shift, one more moment of putting someone else first. Needing felt dangerous. Needing felt like weakness. And I couldn't afford to be weak, not when I'd built my entire identity around being strong enough to handle everything alone. The second week, David's girlfriend called. Rachel. Sweet girl. Or at least I'd thought so. She'd come to dinner a few times, had complimented my cooking, had laughed at my stories about David as a child. I'd let myself imagine, just briefly, what it might be like to have a daughter-in-law someday. Someone to share holidays with. Someone who might understand the particular kind of love that mothers carry. "Mrs. Morrison?" Her voice was hesitant, uncomfortable. "I just wanted to let you know that David is staying with me for a while. He said you two had a disagreement." A disagreement. As if my son telling me he wished I weren't his mother was just a difference of opinion. Something that could be smoothed over with time and distance, like deciding whether to paint a room blue or gray. "Is he okay?" I asked. Because even now, even after everything, that was still my first question. Always my first question. "He's fine," Rachel said, but there was something in her voice I couldn't quite identify. Awkwardness, maybe. Or pity. "He's just processing some things. About his childhood. About you. About me. Not about us. Not about our relationship. About me. As if I were a problem to be analyzed. A puzzle to be solved. A chapter in his story that he needed to make sense of before he could move forward with his real life." "Did he tell you what happened?" I kept my voice steady even though my hands were shaking. There was a pause. Too long. The kind of pause that meant yes, he'd told her. And whatever he'd said had made her see me differently. "He mentioned that you've been having trouble letting him live his own life, that you have expectations that feel overwhelming to him." Expectations. Like expecting your son to remember your birthday. Like expecting basic respect. Like expecting that 25 years of devotion might earn you more than contempt and abandonment. "I see," I said, because what else was there to say? "Thank you for calling, Rachel. I appreciate you letting me know he's safe." After I hung up, I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd helped David with his homework every night, where I'd taught him to read, where I'd listened to his dreams about becoming a lawyer and told him I believed in him, and I finally let myself cry. Not the quiet tears I'd shed in private over the years. These were the kind of sobs that come from somewhere deep, somewhere you didn't even know existed until the pain reached down and pulled them out. The third week, I ran into David's godmother at the grocery store. Sandra. She'd been my best friend once, back when David was little, back when we'd been young mothers navigating parenthood together. We'd drifted apart over the years the way people do, but we still exchanged Christmas cards, still asked about each other's families when we crossed paths at the pharmacy or the post office. "Alice," she said my name with surprise. Then immediately her face shifted into something more careful. "How are you doing?" There it was again. That question that wasn't really a question. That tone that said she'd heard something, knew something, was asking not because she wanted to know, but because social convention required it. "I'm fine," I said automatically, reaching for a can of soup I didn't need just to have something to do with my hands. "I saw David last weekend," Sandra continued, and I felt my entire body tense. "At that new restaurant downtown. He was with a group of friends. They seemed to be having a good time." She didn't say it meanly. That was the worst part. She said it kindly, gently, the way you might tell someone that their husband was seen laughing with another woman, not to hurt them, but because you thought they should know, because you thought they deserved to know that the person they were mourning was out there living, thriving, apparently unburdened by the relationship they'd destroyed. "That's nice," I managed. "I'm glad he's doing well." Sandra touched my arm with a sympathy that made me want to scream. "Have you two talked at all?" "Not yet. He needs space." "Oh, honey." And there it was. The pity, the judgment wrapped in compassion. "I'm sure he'll come around. You know how kids are at that age. They need to separate from their parents, establish their independence. It's normal. Normal. As if there was anything normal about a son who wouldn't speak to his mother. As if there was anything normal about feeling like a stranger to the person you'd given your entire life to create and raise and love. I finished my shopping in a daze, putting items in my cart without really seeing them. At the checkout, the young cashier smiled at me with the blank pleasantness of someone going through motions, and I wondered if I looked as broken on the outside as I felt on the inside. Probably not. I'd gotten good at hiding it. You don't work in healthcare for 20 years without learning how to compartmentalize, how to separate what you feel from what you show. At home, I unpacked groceries I didn't remember buying, pasta I wouldn't eat, vegetables that would rot in my refrigerator because cooking for one felt like admitting defeat. I'd spent so many years preparing meals for two, planning around David's preferences, timing dinner for when he'd get home. Now, the kitchen felt like a museum of a life that didn't exist anymore. The 4th week, I stopped expecting him to call. That was somehow worse than the waiting had been. The waiting had been painful, but it had been active, a kind of hope suspended in anxiety. But this acceptance? It felt like watching myself die slowly, one expectation at a time. I started noticing things I'd never paid attention to before. How quiet the house was without his music filtering down from upstairs. How empty the driveway looked with just my old sedan. No second car announcing that someone young and vital lived here too. How the refrigerator door no longer carried his schedule, his reminders to himself, his grocery requests scrawled on sticky notes I'd always honored. I'd built my entire world around being David's mother, and now that he'd decided he didn't want me in that role anymore, I didn't know who I was supposed to be. My coworker Jennifer asked me to lunch one day. We usually ate together in the break room, comparing notes on difficult patients and sharing complaints about hospital administration. But that day, she suggested we go out, get away from the fluorescent lights and antiseptic smell. Over salads neither of us really wanted, she finally said what she'd clearly been building up to. "Alice, I don't want to overstep, but you haven't seemed like yourself lately. Is everything okay at home?" And because I was tired, because the weight of pretending was becoming too heavy to carry alone, because sometimes you need to say things out loud to make them real, I told her. Not everything, but enough. She listened without interrupting, her face shifting through expressions I couldn't quite read. When I finished, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You know what I think?" she said quietly. "I think you've spent so long being what everyone needed that you forgot to figure out what you need. And now that your son doesn't need you anymore, or thinks he doesn't, you're lost because you never built anything for yourself." Her words should have stung. Instead, they felt like relief, like someone finally naming the thing I'd been circling around but couldn't quite articulate. "But he's my son," I said, and my voice broke on the word. "He's supposed to need me. That's what children do. That's what mothers are for." "Oh, honey." Jennifer's eyes were sad, but clear. "Children grow up. That's what they're supposed to do. But mothers are supposed to grow too. Not just grow older, but grow into themselves, into people who exist beyond motherhood." I drove home that day with her words echoing in my head, mixing with David's, with Rachel's, with Sandra's pitying eyes, and Patricia's careful concern. Everyone seemed to have an opinion about who I was, what I'd done wrong, how I needed to change. But no one asked what it felt like to have your whole world reduced to a void in the shape of the person you loved most. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, thick cream cardstock with elegant gold lettering announcing David's promotion celebration, a dinner party at some upscale restaurant I'd never heard of, hosted by his firm. The kind of event where success was displayed like fine china, where everyone dressed in clothes that cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, where belonging meant having the right job, the right connections, the right last name. My name was written on the envelope in handwriting I didn't recognize. Not David's. Probably Rachel's or maybe his assistants. A courtesy invitation, the kind you send to family members you're obligated to include but don't really want there. I held it in my hands for a long time, reading it over and over, trying to decode what it meant that he'd invited me after 5 weeks of silence. Was this an olive branch? An apology without words? Or was it something else? A performance? A chance for him to show his colleagues that he had a mother, that he came from somewhere, even if that somewhere embarrassed him? I almost didn't go. I stood in front of my closet the night before, staring at clothes that suddenly seemed inadequate, outdated, wrong. I had my work uniforms and my casual clothes and one black dress I'd bought for funerals. Nothing that said, successful lawyer's mother. Nothing that would help me blend into a world I'd never been part of. But I went, because he was still my son, because maybe this was his way of reaching out, because hope, even foolish hope, dies harder than it should. The restaurant was the kind of place where the hostess looked at you like she could calculate your net worth from your shoes. I gave David's name and watched her expression shift into something professional, but cool. She led me through a dining room that felt more like a gallery than a place to eat. All modern art and dramatic lighting and tables positioned far enough apart that conversations couldn't bleed into each other. David stood near the bar with a group of men in expensive suits, holding a glass of something amber that caught the light. He looked different. Not just older. He'd looked older for a while now, but polished, refined, like he'd been buffed to a shine that removed any rough edges that might have connected him to the working-class life he'd come from. When he saw me, his smile froze. Just for a second, but I caught it. That moment of calculation, of decision about how to react to my presence. Then the smile returned, broader, faker, and he excused himself from his colleagues. "Mom, you came." He kissed my cheek. A gesture so formal it felt like greeting a distant relative at a funeral. "I wasn't sure you would." "You invited me," I said simply, because what else was there to say? "Right. Yes, of course." He glanced back at his group, then at me, and I could see him trying to figure out how to navigate this, how to acknowledge me without claiming me too fully. "Let me introduce you to some people." He led me over to the group of men he'd been talking to. They were all younger than me, all radiating the kind of confidence that comes from never having to worry about whether you'll make rent. David introduced me with the bare minimum of information. "This is my mother, Alice." Not, "This is my mother who raised me alone," or, "This is my mother who worked 2 jobs to put me through college." Just Alice. A name without a story. A person without context. "Nice to meet you," one of them said with the polite disinterest of someone making conversation they didn't want to have. "David's told us so much about you." It was a lie. A pleasant social lie that we all pretended to believe. David hadn't told them anything about me because there was nothing about me that enhanced his image. Nothing about my life that complemented the story he was building for himself. I smiled and nodded and let the conversation flow around me like water around a stone. They talked about cases and clients and golf games at country clubs I'd never visit. They made jokes I didn't understand and referenced people I'd never meet. And David laughed with them, matched their energy, became one of them so completely that I wondered if the boy I'd raised had ever really existed, or if I'd just imagined him. Rachel appeared at some point, looking beautiful in a dress that probably cost more than my car payment. She greeted me with a hug that felt obligatory, her perfume expensive and overwhelming. "Mrs. Morrison, so glad you could make it," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "David was hoping you'd come." Another lie. Or maybe not. Maybe he had hoped I'd come so he could show me this, his new life, his success, everything he'd become without my help. Maybe this was meant to be a message. Look what I did. Look what I am. Look what I became when I stopped letting you hold me back. Dinner was served at a long table where the seating arrangement had clearly been planned. I found myself at the far end, separated from David by at least 8 people. Close to colleagues' spouses who seemed as uncertain about their place in this gathering as I was. We made small talk about nothing, weather, traffic, the quality of the bread, while at the other end of the table, I could hear David holding court, telling stories that earned laughs and impressed nods. At one point, one of the senior partners stood to give a toast. He talked about David's potential, his dedication, his bright future with the firm, He mentioned David's work ethic, his intelligence, his drive. He made no mention of where that drive came from, who had instilled it, who had sacrificed to make this moment possible. When David stood to respond, thanking his colleagues and mentors, he looked right past me. His eyes swept the table, acknowledging people who mattered, people who had influence, people who could help him climb higher. When his gaze finally landed on me, it was brief, uncomfortable, before sliding away to safer territory. "I'm grateful to everyone who believed in me," he said, his voice confident and warm. "To those who pushed me to be better, to work harder, to never settle for less than excellence. Everyone who believed in him. As if I hadn't been the first, hadn't been the only one for so many years. As if my belief had been worth nothing because it came with scuffed shoes and grocery store cake instead of champagne and designer clothes." After dinner, while people mingled over coffee and dessert, I found myself alone near the window, looking out at the city lights. This was David's world now. These were his people. And I was just a reminder of where he'd come from, an embarrassment he'd invited out of obligation and now regretted. "Mrs. Morrison?" A woman I didn't recognize approached me, maybe in her 40s, with kind eyes and a gentler demeanor than most of the people in this room. "I'm Helen. I work with David. It's nice to meet you," I said, grateful for any conversation that didn't feel like an endurance test. "I just wanted to say, your son is brilliant. Really brilliant. We're lucky to have him." She paused, and something in her expression shifted. "He doesn't talk about his family much, but I can imagine you must be very proud." "I am," I said, and it was true even though it hurt. "He's accomplished so much." Helen nodded, then said quietly, almost carefully, "He mentioned once that his father wasn't in the picture. That must have been difficult, raising him alone. So he had told someone, just enough to explain my absence without claiming my presence. Just enough to justify why his mother wasn't prominent in his life, why she sat at the end of the table instead of next to him, why she didn't fit into the image he was constructing. We managed," I said, because what else could I say? That I'd given up everything? That I'd worked until my feet bled and my back ached? That I'd skipped meals so he could eat, worn the same coat for 10 years so he could have new clothes, stayed home every Friday night while other women my age dated and danced because I couldn't afford a babysitter? Before Helen could respond, David appeared at my elbow. "Mom, I need to talk to you," he said, his voice low and tight. He led me away from the crowd, into a quiet corner near the restrooms, where the ambient noise of conversation became a distant murmur. His face was tense, his jaw set in that way it got when he was angry but trying to control it. "What are you doing?" he asked, and there was accusation in his tone that I didn't understand. "I'm sorry?" "Talking to Helen, telling her about our past. I don't need you sharing our personal business with my colleagues. Our personal business. As if my life was a secret to be kept. A shameful history that needed to be hidden away like old photographs you don't want guests to see. She asked about you," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "She said you were brilliant." I agreed. "You don't understand." He ran his hand through his hair, a gesture I recognized from his childhood when he was frustrated. "This is a professional environment. These people don't need to know where I came from or what my life was like before. It doesn't help me here. It just makes things complicated. Complicated. That's what I was now. Not his mother. Not the woman who'd shaped him. Just a complication. An inconvenience. Something to be managed and minimized. I didn't come here to embarrass you, David," I said quietly. "You invited me. I thought maybe you wanted me here. I invited you because Rachel said it would look bad if I didn't. Because people ask about family and I needed to be able to say I had a mother who cared enough to come." His words were sharp, precise, designed to cut. "But that doesn't mean I need you telling everyone about how hard we had it, or how much you sacrificed. Nobody here cares about that, Mom. They care about who I am now, not where I came from." I felt something inside me go very still, very cold. This wasn't just indifference anymore. This was active shame. My son was ashamed of me, not just of my circumstances, but of me, of the choices I'd made, the life I'd lived, the person I was. "I see," I said, and my voice sounded far away even to my own ears. "I'll leave then. I wouldn't want to complicate things further." "Mom, don't..." He reached for my arm, but I stepped back. No, you're right. This isn't my world. I don't belong here. I looked at him, really looked at him. This stranger wearing my son's face. I'm proud of what you've accomplished, David. I always have been. I'm sorry that I'm not the kind of mother you can be proud of. I walked out of that restaurant with my head up and my spine straight, the way I'd learned to walk through hospital corridors when patients screamed or died or blamed you for things beyond your control. I didn't cry until I reached my car, until I was safely alone in the darkness of the parking garage where no one could see me break. I stopped answering the phone after that night. Not because David called, he didn't, but because I couldn't bear the thought of anyone else asking how I was doing, offering sympathy that felt more like judgment, suggesting that maybe if I'd done things differently, been different, my son wouldn't be ashamed to call me his mother. The house became my cave. I went to work because I had to, because bills don't stop coming just because your heart stops working properly. But the moment I walked through my front door, I disappeared into a silence so complete it felt like drowning. I stopped cooking real meals. What was the point? I ate cereal standing at the counter, or toast, or nothing at all. Food tasted like cardboard anyway. My bedroom still held remnants of David's childhood, boxes of his old things I'd never had the heart to throw away. His baby clothes, impossibly small and soft. His elementary school art projects, stick figures labeled me and mom in wobbly letters. His middle school trophies for academic achievements, debate team, that one season of basketball where he'd been terrible but tried so hard. I pulled those boxes out one Saturday morning when sleep had become impossible and dawn felt like mockery. I sat on my bedroom floor surrounded by the archaeology of motherhood, holding tiny shoes that his feet had once filled, reading report cards where teachers praised his kindness and curiosity, staring at photographs of a little boy who'd looked at me like I hung the moon. Where had I lost him? At what point had his love curdled into resentment? Was it gradual? A slow erosion I'd been too close to notice? Or had there been a specific moment, a particular failure on my part that shifted everything? I remembered the time he was 12 and asked about his father. Really asked. Not just the vague questions children pose when they're too young to understand complicated answers. He wanted to know why his dad had left, if it was because of him, if I'd driven him away somehow. And I'd lied, not maliciously, but protectively. I'd told him his father had loved him but wasn't ready to be a parent, that sometimes adults make mistakes they can't fix. But the truth was uglier than that. The truth was that David's father had been a mistake I'd made when I was 28, and lonely, and stupid enough to believe a man who said all the right things while meaning none of them. He'd stuck around for 3 years, long enough for me to believe we were building something real, and then he'd left with a woman from his office and a note that said he'd never wanted to be tied down with a kid. I hadn't told David that. How could I? How do you tell your child that his existence was someone else's burden? That the man who gave him life had viewed him as an anchor rather than a gift? So I'd softened the story, rounded its sharp edges, made it bearable even though it meant David might blame me instead of his father for the absence. Maybe that had been my mistake. Maybe by protecting his father's memory, I'd made myself the villain by default. The parent who was there became the one who could be blamed for everything, for not being enough, for not providing enough, for not being the kind of mother whose love could compensate for a father's abandonment. I found a photograph from his high school graduation. I stood next to him in a dress I'd bought specifically for that day, navy blue because he'd said I should wear something nice. I was smiling so wide my cheeks hurt, my arm around his shoulders, my pride radiating from every pixel. He was smiling too, but looking at it now with different eyes, I could see that his smile didn't reach his eyes. Even then, even 4 years ago, he'd already been pulling away and I'd been too happy to notice. The doorbell rang late that afternoon. I almost didn't answer it. I was still sitting on the floor, surrounded by boxes and memories, wearing pajamas at 3 p.m. Because what did it matter anymore? But the ringing persisted, insistent and unapologetic, until I finally dragged myself downstairs. Patricia stood on my porch holding a casserole dish wrapped in aluminum foil. "I know you said you're fine," she said before I could speak, "but I also know what fine looks like, and honey, you're not it. I made too much lasagna and I'm not taking no for an answer." She pushed past me into my house with the authority of a woman who'd decided someone needed help whether they wanted it or not. She went straight to my kitchen, put the lasagna in the refrigerator, then turned to face me with her hands on her hips. "When's the last time you ate a real meal? Patricia, I appreciate this, but when's the last time you showered? Changed your clothes? Opened your curtains?" Her voice was firm, but not unkind. "Alice, I've lived next door to you for 17 years. I watched you raise that boy alone. I saw you leave for work before dawn and come home after dark. I saw you at every school event, every parent-teacher conference, every sports game even though he was terrible at sports. Don't think I don't see what's happening now." I felt my throat tighten. He doesn't want me in his life. Then he's a fool. Patricia pulled out a chair at my kitchen table and pointed at it. "Sit." I sat because I was too tired to argue. She sat across from me, her face serious. "My daughter did something similar to me about 10 years ago. Decided I was too old-fashioned, too embarrassing, too much of a reminder of where she came from. Stopped calling, stopped visiting, made excuses every holiday. I thought I'd die from it. From being invisible to the person I'd loved most in the world." "What happened?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Life happened. She got married, had a baby, realized that parenting is hard and that maybe her mother had done the best she could with what she had. She came back, not with an apology, she's too proud for that, but with a gradual thawing, an acknowledgement that maybe she'd been unfair. Did it fix things?" Patricia was quiet for a moment. "It made things different. Not the same as before, but different. I learned that I couldn't base my worth on whether my daughter valued me. I had to find value in myself, for myself. That was the hard part." She reached across the table and took my hand. "Alice, I don't know if David will come around or not, but I do know that you can't keep living like this. Like you're already dead just because he's decided he doesn't need you. You're 56 years old. You've got life left in you. You've got to figure out who you are when you're not being his mother." After she left, I ate the lasagna standing at the counter. It was good, rich and cheesy and made with actual care. I ate until I was full, until I could feel my body remembering what nourishment felt like. Then I went upstairs and took a shower, standing under water as hot as I could bear, letting it wash away days of neglect and something deeper I couldn't name. I looked at myself in the steamed mirror afterward. Really looked. I saw the gray threading through my hair that I'd stopped bothering to cover, the lines around my eyes that came from decades of smiling through exhaustion, the slope of my shoulders that suggested a spine that had carried too much weight for too long. I looked old, tired, used up, but I also saw something else. Beneath the exhaustion and grief, there was still something solid, still some core of myself that had survived everything. Poverty, abandonment, single motherhood. Now this. I'd bent, but not broken. Not yet. Not completely. The next day at work, I volunteered for extra shifts. Not because I needed the money, though I always needed the money, but because I needed something to do besides sit in my house, mourning a relationship that was apparently already dead. I needed to remember that I was good at something, that I had value beyond what David had decided I was worth. Jennifer noticed. "You're taking every shift they offer. You okay?" "I'm trying to be," I said honestly. "I'm trying to figure out what okay looks like when your foundation disappears." She studied me for a moment, then said, "You know what helped me after my divorce? I took a class, something completely random that I'd never done before. Pottery. Turned out I was terrible at it, but it didn't matter because I was doing something just for me, not because anyone needed me to or expected me to. A class. Something for myself. The idea felt foreign, almost selfish. I'd spent so many years doing things because they were necessary. Working because bills needed paying, cooking because David needed feeding, cleaning because houses didn't maintain themselves. Doing something just because I wanted to felt like a luxury I hadn't earned. But maybe that was the problem. Maybe I'd spent so long being useful that I'd forgotten how to be happy. Maybe I'd confused necessity with worth and lost track of any version of myself that existed outside of service to others. That week, I saw an advertisement at the community center for a book club. They met Tuesday evenings, discussed everything from classics to contemporary fiction, welcomed new members. I used to love reading, back before life got so busy that leisure felt like laziness. I'd devoured books in my 20s, stayed up late turning pages while David slept, escaped into stories when reality felt too heavy. I went to the first meeting with my stomach in knots, feeling like an imposter, like someone who didn't deserve to take time for something as frivolous as discussing novels. But the women there welcomed me without questions, passed me wine in a plastic cup, argued passionately about whether the protagonist of their current selection was sympathetic or irredeemable. For 2 hours, I wasn't David's mother. I wasn't the woman whose son was ashamed of her. I wasn't the failure or the embarrassment or the complication. I was just Alice, a woman with opinions about books, capable of intelligent conversation, worthy of being heard. It wasn't healing. Not yet. But it was something. A tiny crack in the darkness where light might eventually find its way in. Still, the nights were brutal. The nights when I lay in bed and replayed every conversation, every choice, every moment where I might have gone wrong. The nights when I wondered if love was supposed to hurt this much, if sacrifice was supposed to feel this futile, if mothers everywhere felt this invisible, or if I was uniquely flawed in ways I'd never understood. But I had something I hadn't had before that dinner party. I had the beginning of understanding that maybe, just maybe, my worth wasn't determined by whether David loved me back. Maybe it never had been. 3 months had passed since that terrible birthday. 3 months since I'd last spoken to my son. In that time, I'd learned to wake up without immediately reaching for my phone to see if he'd called. I'd learned to cook meals for one without feeling like I was admitting defeat. I'd learned to exist in my own company without the constant ache of his absence consuming every moment. I wouldn't call it healing. It was more like adaptation. The way your body learns to function with chronic pain. Not because the pain goes away, but because you run out of energy to fight it every single second. I was cleaning out the hall closet one Saturday morning when I found the box. It was pushed far back on the top shelf, behind old winter coats and boxes of Christmas decorations I hadn't looked at in years. A simple cardboard box worn at the edges, with my mother's handwriting across the top. For Alice. Open when you're ready. Oh, my mother had died 6 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, quick and merciless. We'd had 3 months from diagnosis to funeral, barely enough time to say goodbye, certainly not enough time to say everything that needed saying between mothers and daughters. I'd been so focused on caring for her during those final weeks, managing her pain and her doctors and her deteriorating condition, that I'd never asked what she meant by, when you're ready. Ready for what? I'd wondered at the time. But then David had needed me for something. College applications, maybe, or some crisis I've since forgotten. And the box had gone into the closet, and my mother's cryptic instruction had faded into the background noise of life's demands. Now I pulled it down, disturbing a layer of dust that made me sneeze. The box was heavier than I expected. I carried it to my kitchen table, made myself a cup of tea I didn't really want, and sat staring at it for a long time before I found the courage to open it. Inside were letters, dozens of them, in envelopes that had yellowed with age. Some were addressed to my mother in handwriting I didn't recognize. Others were in my mother's hand, unsealed, as if she'd written them but never sent them. And there, on top, was a sealed envelope with my name on it in her familiar script. My hands shook as I opened it. "My dearest Alice," it began, and I could hear her voice as clearly as if she were sitting across from me. "If you're reading this, it means I'm gone and you've finally found the courage, or the desperation, to look in this box. I'm sorry I didn't give it to you while I was alive. Some truths are easier to share when you're not around to see the pain they cause." I had to stop reading, my vision blurred with tears I hadn't expected. I took a shaky breath and continued. "There are things about your father you never knew. Things I kept from you because I thought I was protecting you, the same way you've been protecting David from the truth about his father. Yes, I knew about that. I knew because I did the same thing, and I watched you repeat my mistakes with the same good intentions and the same terrible consequences. Your father didn't leave us because he fell out of love with me, Alice. He left because I got pregnant with you, and he wasn't the man I thought he was. He was married to someone else, had been for 15 years. I was the other woman, though I didn't know it until I told him about you, and he gave me money for an abortion and told me never to contact him again. I kept you anyway. I raised you alone, worked 3 jobs, and told you your father was a good man who died before you were born, because I couldn't bear for you to know that you were unwanted by the man who made you. I thought I was sparing you pain. Instead, I taught you to accept less than you deserved, to shrink yourself to make others comfortable, to believe that your worth came from how much you could sacrifice, rather than who you fundamentally were. I couldn't breathe, couldn't process what I was reading. My father, the man my mother had described in vague, nostalgic terms, the ghost I'd mourned without ever really knowing, had been a lie, a comfortable fiction designed to protect me from a brutal truth. I watched you do the same thing with David, the letter continued. I watched you work yourself to exhaustion, put his needs before your own in ways that weren't healthy for either of you. I watched you teach him that mothers exist to serve, that women should be grateful for whatever love they're given, that sacrifice is its own reward. And I said nothing because, who was I to criticize? I'd done the exact same thing. But Alice, here's what I learned too late, what I hope you'll learn while there's still time. Children don't respect parents who make themselves small. They learn to expect it, to demand it, to feel burdened by any request for reciprocity. By never asking David for anything, by never showing him that you were a person with needs and limits and a life beyond his, you taught him that you were infinite and inexhaustible. And when he finally figured out that you weren't, he resented you for the deception. I pushed the letter away, my hands trembling. This couldn't be right. I'd sacrificed everything for David because I loved him, because that's what mothers did. How could that be wrong? How could love be a mistake? But even as I rejected the words, something inside me recognized their truth. I'd never asked David for help, even when I desperately needed it. I'd never told him when I was sick or struggling or so exhausted I could barely stand. I'd presented myself as eternally capable, endlessly giving, never requiring anything in return. And he'd learned to see me exactly as I'd portrayed myself, as a resource to be used rather than a person to be considered. I picked up the letter again, forced myself to keep reading. In this box are letters from your father. He wrote to me over the years, though I never responded. Apologies, excuses, justifications for his choices. I kept them because I thought someday you might want to know who he really was, beyond my sanitized version. But I also kept something else. Letters I wrote to you over the years but never sent. Things I wanted to say but couldn't, because I was afraid of burdening you, of seeming weak, of not being the strong mother you needed me to be. Read them if you want, or don't. But Alice, please learn what I never did. That being strong doesn't mean suffering in silence. That protecting others from truth doesn't make the truth disappear. That children need to see their parents as whole people, not just as sources of support. And that love, real love, requires honesty, even when honesty is hard. The letter ended with her signature and a final line. You were never unwanted by me. You were the best thing that ever happened to me. Even though I did a terrible job of showing you how to value yourself, I'm sorry I couldn't teach you better. I'm sorry I taught you my worst lessons along with my best ones. I love you. Always have, always will. Mom. I sat at that table for hours, reading through the letters. My father's words were exactly as pathetic as I'd imagined they'd be. Self-serving, weak, full of excuses about timing and circumstances and the complications of his real life. Each letter made me angrier, not at him. He was already dead to me, but at my mother for carrying this secret alone, for protecting him when he deserved nothing but contempt. But it was my mother's unsent letters that broke me completely. Letters about how tired she was, how scared, how sometimes she resented having to be strong all the time. Letters about the men she'd wanted to date but didn't, because she thought I needed stability more than she needed companionship. Letters about dreams she'd abandoned and paths she'd never taken, because motherhood had consumed everything else. In one letter, written when I was 16, she wrote, Alice thinks I'm happy, and I let her believe it, because what good would it do to tell her the truth, that I'm lonely, that I wonder sometimes what my life would have looked like if I'd made different choices? She needs to believe that sacrifice is noble, that love is enough, because if she doesn't believe that, then what was the point of any of it? I understood then, with devastating clarity, what my mother had been trying to tell me. We'd both made the same mistake. We'd both confused martyrdom with love, had both taught our children that mothers weren't fully human, that we existed in some separate category where needs and wants and limits didn't apply. And our children had learned the lesson perfectly. They'd learned to take without guilt, to expect without gratitude, to move on without looking back because we'd taught them that mothers were infinite resources that could never be depleted. I thought about David at that dinner party, uncomfortable with my presence, asking me not to share our past with his colleagues. I thought about the shame in his eyes, the way he'd distanced himself from everything we'd been through together, and I realized that I'd created that shame, not intentionally, but systematically. By never letting him see me struggle, by never admitting that I had limits, by always being available no matter the cost to myself, I'd taught him that I was something other than human. And when he'd finally seen the cracks, when he'd realized I was just a woman who'd done her best with limited resources, he'd felt betrayed by the revelation. I pulled out my phone. My fingers hovered over David's contact information. I'd deleted our text history weeks ago, unable to bear seeing the messages go from frequent to rare to non-existent. But his number was still there, waiting. I didn't call him. Not yet. I wasn't ready for that conversation, but I did something I should have done years ago. I opened a new note on my phone and I started writing. Not to him, but for myself. Things I need to say to my son, I titled it. And beneath that, I began listing truths I'd never spoken out loud. That I'd been exhausted for 25 years. That I'd needed help but never asked for it. That I'd been scared and uncertain and lonely, but had hidden it because I thought that's what good mothers did. That I'd resented him sometimes. In brief flashes, I'd immediately felt guilty about, because resentment seemed incompatible with love. But resentment and love could coexist. Fear and strength could coexist. Sacrifice and regret could coexist. I'd been afraid to acknowledge that complexity because it felt like admitting failure. But maybe the real failure was in pretending to be something I wasn't. Infinitely patient, endlessly giving, without needs of my own. My mother had tried to warn me, in the only way she could, by showing me her own letters, her own struggles. She was giving me permission to be honest about mine. She was telling me that it wasn't too late to change the pattern, to break the cycle, to show David that I was a person, not just a role. I didn't know if he'd listen. I didn't know if he'd care. But I finally understood that I needed to say these things, not because they'd change him, but because they were true. Because I deserved to be seen as I actually was, not as the sanitized version I'd presented to make his life easier. That night, for the first time in months, I slept deeply. Not peacefully. I still woke up several times, still felt the ache of David's absence. But beneath the pain was something new, something that felt almost like clarity, almost like purpose. I wasn't going to keep waiting for my son to decide I was worthy of his attention. I was going to show him who I really was, and let him make his choice based on truth rather than the carefully constructed fiction I'd maintained for decades. And whatever he decided, I would survive it. Because I'd already survived everything else. I spent the next 2 weeks writing, not constantly, but in stolen moments between shifts, during quiet evenings when the house felt less oppressive and more like simply empty. I wrote everything I'd never said, every truth I'd swallowed, every moment of exhaustion and fear and doubt that I'd hidden behind a smile and the insistence that everything was fine. The letter to David grew longer than I'd intended. Pages and pages of things that needed saying, though I had no idea if he'd ever read them. I didn't write it with anger, though anger was there, threaded through the words like a vein of gold through stone. I wrote it with honesty, raw, uncomfortable, complete honesty that felt both terrifying and liberating. I told him about the times I'd skipped meals so he could have lunch money, about the promotion I'd turned down because it would have meant evening shifts and no one to make him dinner, about the medical issues I'd ignored because I couldn't afford to miss work, couldn't afford the copays, couldn't afford to be anything less than perfectly functional when he needed me. I told him about his father, not the sanitized version I'd fed him for years, but the truth, that he'd been a man who'd made promises he never intended to keep, who'd walked away without looking back, who'd sent exactly 3 child support checks in 25 years before disappearing completely. That I'd protected that truth not to spare his father, but to spare David the knowledge that he'd been unwanted by half the people who'd created him. But I also wrote about love, about the moment they'd placed him in my arms at the hospital, and I'd looked into his scrunched red face and felt a love so overwhelming it had physically hurt. About watching him learn to walk, to read, to think for himself. About the pride I'd felt at every accomplishment, no matter how small. About how even now, even after everything, I couldn't imagine my life without having known him. I don't regret having you, I wrote. I don't regret the sacrifices, even though they were harder than I ever let you see. But I do regret teaching you that mothers aren't people, that we don't hurt, don't struggle, don't need anything in return for what we give. I regret not showing you my humanity along with my strength, because in hiding my struggles, I made you believe I was invincible. And when you finally realized I wasn't, you felt betrayed instead of sympathetic. I didn't seal the letter. I left it on my kitchen table, reading it over and over, adding sentences, crossing out others, refining until the words felt true in a way that went beyond factual accuracy. This was emotional truth, the kind that couldn't be captured in simple declarative statements, but required paragraphs of context, nuance, explanation. On a Thursday evening, when I'd finally accepted that the letter was as complete as it would ever be, I made a decision. I would deliver it in person, not to force a conversation, not to demand anything from him, but because some things were too important to trust to text messages or email or the distance of mailed paper. I called his office. His assistant answered with practiced professionalism, asking who was calling and what this was regarding. His mother, I said simply. I need to speak with him. There was a pause. Too long. The kind of pause that suggested she'd been given instructions about what to do if I called. Mr. Morrison is in meetings most of the day. Can I take a message? Tell him I'm coming to his office tomorrow at noon. I won't take much of his time, but I need to see him. Another pause. I'll relay the message, Mrs. Morrison. I hung up before she could make excuses on his behalf, before I could talk myself out of this decision that felt both necessary and terrifying. That night, I barely slept. I kept imagining different scenarios. David refusing to see me, David having security escort me out, David sitting across from me with that cold, distant expression while I poured out my heart and he remained unmoved. But I also imagined the possibility, however slim, that he might listen, that he might understand, that we might find some way forward that didn't require me to disappear in order for him to be comfortable. I dressed carefully the next morning, not to impress his colleagues. I'd learned that lesson, but to feel strong. I wore a simple navy dress that made me look professional, capable, like a woman who deserved to be heard. I did my makeup, something I rarely bothered with anymore. Not heavy, just enough to hide the shadows under my eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights. The drive to his office took 30 minutes through midday traffic. I'd looked up the address, studied the building online so I'd know where I was going. It was downtown, glass and steel and modern architecture that suggested success and importance. The kind of building I'd never had reason to enter before. The lobby was intimidating. Marble floors, abstract art on the walls, a security desk where I had to sign in and explain my purpose. The guard called upstairs, spoke in low tones I couldn't quite hear, then handed me a visitor badge with instructions to take the elevator to the 14th floor. My reflection in the elevator's mirrored walls showed a woman who looked older than 56, worn down by life in ways that went beyond simple aging. But there was something else, too, a determination in my jaw, a steadiness in my eyes that hadn't been there 3 months ago. David's assistant met me as I exited the elevator. She was young, maybe 25, dressed in clothes that probably cost more than my monthly salary. Her smile was polite but not warm. Mrs. Morrison, David asked me to tell you that he's in back-to-back meetings today. He won't be able to see you. I'd expected this. Prepared for it, even. I'll wait. I'm not sure how long he'll be. That's fine. I have time. I moved toward the waiting area before she could protest further, settling into a leather chair that was more comfortable than any furniture I owned. She hesitated, clearly uncertain how to handle a mother who wouldn't be dismissed. Finally, she returned to her desk, typed something on her computer, and picked up her phone. I couldn't hear what she said, but I watched her glance at me several times during the conversation. An hour passed, then 2. Other people came and went, men in expensive suits, women carrying designer bags, everyone moving with the purposeful urgency of people whose time was valuable. Some glanced at me curiously, probably wondering what I was doing there, if I was a client or a job applicant or something else entirely. I didn't move, didn't check my phone obsessively or fidget or give any indication that I was uncomfortable with waiting. I'd spent 25 years waiting for David to come home from school, to finish his homework, to call when he said he would. I could wait a few more hours. Around 2:30, a door opened and David emerged with 2 other men, all of them laughing about something I couldn't hear. He saw me immediately. The laughter died on his face, replaced by something that looked like panic mixed with anger. He said something to his companions, who glanced at me with undisguised curiosity before heading toward the elevators. Then David walked over, his jaw tight, his body language radiating discomfort and irritation. "Mom, what are you doing here?" I stood, holding the envelope that contained my letter. "I came to give you this, and to say some things I should have said a long time ago. This isn't appropriate. This is my workplace. You can't just show up here without what? Without permission. Without an invitation." I kept my voice calm, steady, even though my heart was racing. "You won't return my calls. You won't answer my messages. What exactly did you expect me to do?" He glanced around, acutely aware that his assistant could hear us, that other people were probably watching. "Let's go into my office." He led me down a hallway to a corner office with windows overlooking the city. It was beautiful. Expensive furniture, framed degrees on the wall, photographs of him at various professional events. None of the photographs included me. He closed the door and turned to face me, his arms crossed defensively. "You're embarrassing me." "I'm not trying to embarrass you, David. I'm trying to be seen by you." I held out the envelope. "I wrote you a letter. Everything I should have told you years ago but didn't, because I thought I was protecting you. Read it or don't. That's your choice. But I need you to have it." He didn't take it, just stared at the envelope like it might contain something dangerous. "What is this? Some kind of guilt trip? Some attempt to make me feel bad for having boundaries?" "It's the truth." I set the envelope on his desk since he wouldn't take it from my hand. "The truth about your father. The truth about what it cost me to raise you alone. The truth about all the things I hid from you because I thought that's what good mothers did." "I don't want to hear this." But his voice had lost some of its edge. He sounded tired suddenly, younger than his 28 years. "You don't have to hear it right now, but someday maybe you'll be ready to know who I actually am instead of who you needed me to be." I moved toward the door, then stopped. "I love you, David. I always have, and I always will. But I'm done shrinking myself to make you comfortable. I'm done pretending I don't have needs, don't have feelings, don't deserve basic respect from the person I gave everything to raise. Mom, read the letter, or don't, but know that it's there, and know that I'm not going to keep apologizing for being human." I opened the door, then paused. "Oh, and one more thing. Your grandmother left me letters before she died. Turns out she made the same mistakes I did, taught me the same damaging lessons I taught you, but she figured out the truth before it was too late. She figured out that teaching children to take without giving back isn't love, it's enabling. I just wish I'd understood that sooner." I walked out of his office with my head high, past his assistant who pretended not to have been listening, past the colleagues who definitely had been. I didn't look back. Didn't give him the chance to call me back or dismiss me further. In the elevator, my hands finally started shaking. The adrenaline that had carried me through the confrontation began to fade, leaving behind exhaustion and something else, something that felt almost like peace. I'd done what I came to do. I'd spoken my truth, and whatever happened next was no longer entirely in my control. The drive home felt different than the drive there had been. Lighter somehow, as if I'd left something heavy in that office along with the letter. I didn't know if David would read it, didn't know if it would change anything between us. But I'd finally stopped waiting for him to give me permission to exist as a whole person instead of just his mother. That evening, I sat on my porch with a cup of tea and watched the sun set. My phone sat beside me, silent. I didn't check it. Didn't refresh my messages to see if he'd responded. For the first time in months, I let myself simply exist in the moment, without obsessing over whether my son was thinking about me. Patricia came out of her house and waved. I waved back. She walked over, settled into the chair beside mine without asking if she was intruding. "You look different," she observed. "I feel different." And it was true. Something had shifted. Some fundamental change I couldn't quite articulate but could feel in my bones. Good different? I thought about it. Different. Not better yet, but not worse either. Just different. She nodded like she understood, and we sat there together in comfortable silence, two women who'd survived their own versions of heartbreak, watching the day end and trusting that somehow, eventually, another one would begin. 2 weeks passed without a word from David. I'd be lying if I said it didn't hurt, but the hurt was different now, less consuming, more manageable. I went to work, attended my book club meetings, had coffee with Patricia on Sunday mornings. I was building something that resembled a life, small and quiet, but mine. Then, on a Tuesday evening while I was making dinner, actual dinner, not cereal or toast, but real food I was cooking for myself because I deserved to be nourished. My phone rang. David's name lit up the screen. My hand froze over the cutting board. I stared at his name for 3 rings before I answered, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Hello? Mom." His voice sounded strange. Strained, like he'd been crying or was about to. "Can I come over? I need to talk to you." "Of course. When?" "Now, if that's okay?" 20 minutes later, his car pulled into my driveway. I watched from the kitchen window as he sat there for a long moment. His head bowed, his hands gripping the steering wheel. Finally, he got out and walked to my door with the slow, heavy steps of someone approaching something difficult. I opened it before he could knock. He looked terrible, exhausted, with dark circles under his eyes and a wrinkled shirt that suggested he'd slept in it. This wasn't the polished professional I'd seen in his office. This was my son, stripped of his armor, looking more vulnerable than I'd seen him in years. "Come in," I said quietly. He followed me to the living room but didn't sit. Just stood there looking around at the space like he was seeing it for the first time, or maybe like he was remembering it differently than it actually was. "I read your letter," he said finally. "I've read it probably 20 times in the last 2 weeks. His voice broke. "Mom, I didn't know. About Dad. About any of it. I didn't want you to know. I thought I was protecting you. You were protecting me." He sank onto the couch like his legs couldn't hold him anymore. "You were always protecting me, even when it cost you everything." I sat down across from him, maintaining distance because I wasn't sure what this conversation was yet, where it was going, what it meant. "I talked to Rachel," he continued, staring at his hands. "After you came to my office. She said I was being an asshole, that she couldn't be with someone who treated his mother the way I was treating you. We broke up. David, I didn't want— No, she was right. She said she'd been watching me distance myself from you for months, making excuses, acting ashamed. She said it reminded her of how her father had treated her grandmother before she died, and she'd regretted not standing up to him about it." He looked up at me, and his eyes were red. "She said if I couldn't see how lucky I was to have a mother who loved me that much, then I didn't deserve her." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to comfort him, to smooth over his pain the way I always had. But another part, the part that was learning to exist as more than just his mother, held back. "I started thinking about everything after I read your letter. Really thinking, not just reacting." He rubbed his face with both hands. "I remembered this thing from when I was 8. I got sick at school and they called you at work. You came to get me even though I know now it probably meant losing that day's pay. You took care of me all night, fever, vomiting, the whole thing. And the next morning, you still went to work because you said we needed the money." "I remember," I said softly. "I asked you once why we couldn't have nicer things. Why our house was smaller than my friends' houses. Why we never went on vacations like their families did. You know what you said?" I shook my head, though the memory was coming back to me now. "You said, 'We have everything we need. We have each other, and that's what matters.' And I believed you, Mom. I believed you were happy with what we had, that you didn't want anything more. I never realized you were just making the best of what you could afford, that you were sacrificing constantly, and I was too young, too selfish to see it. You were a child. Children aren't supposed to, but I'm not a child anymore. His voice rose, not with anger but with anguish. I'm 28 years old, and I've been treating you like you existed to serve me, like you were a service provider, not a person. And when you couldn't keep up with my expectations, when you wanted something as basic as my time and attention, I resented you for it. He was crying now, not trying to hide it. That dinner party. God, Mom, I told you not to talk about our past because I was ashamed. Not of you, but of where I came from. Like poverty was something contagious that people might see on me if they knew about it. I was so obsessed with fitting in, with being one of them, that I tried to erase everything that made me who I am. I moved to sit beside him then, close, but not touching. David, wanting to succeed, wanting to be accepted, those aren't bad things. But denying you? Acting like you were an inconvenience? Saying I wished you weren't my mother? His voice cracked completely. How do I come back from that? How do I fix what I said to you? This was the moment I'd been waiting for. The apology, the acknowledgement, the validation that I'd been hurt, and the hurt had been unjust. But now that it was here, I found I didn't need it the way I'd thought I would. Yes, it felt good to be seen, to have my pain recognized, but it didn't undo the damage. Didn't erase the months of silence or the shame I'd felt or the lonely nights wondering if my own son loved me at all. You can't fix it, I said gently. You can only move forward differently than you moved before. I want to do better, be better. He looked at me, and I saw something I hadn't seen in years. Not just remorse, but genuine seeing, like he was finally looking at me as a person instead of a role. I want to know you, Mom, not just as my mother, but as Alice, as the person you are beyond what you've done for me. That might be harder than you think, I said with a small smile. I'm still figuring out who that person is. We talked for hours that night. Really talked, in a way we hadn't since he was a teenager and still believed I might have answers to his questions. He asked about my childhood, about my mother, about the dreams I'd had before he was born. I asked about his work, not just the accomplishments but the struggles, the parts he found difficult, the ways the job wasn't what he'd imagined. He told me about Rachel, how she'd challenged him in ways no one else had, how losing her had made him realize he'd been becoming someone he didn't like. I told him about the book club, about Patricia's friendship, about the slow process of learning to be alone without being lonely. It wasn't healing, not completely. You don't repair 28 years of accumulated patterns and mistakes in one conversation, but it was a beginning, a genuine one, built on honesty instead of the careful fiction we'd both been maintaining. Around midnight, he stood to leave. At the door, he hugged me, really hugged me, not the perfunctory embrace he'd been giving me for years, but something that felt real, that carried actual emotion. I'm sorry, Mom, he whispered against my shoulder. I'm so sorry for all of it. I know, I said. I forgive you. And I did. Not because he deserved it, not because what he'd done was okay, but because holding on to anger was exhausting and I'd been tired for so long. Forgiveness wasn't about absolving him. It was about releasing myself from the weight of resentment. After he left, I sat in my quiet house and let myself feel everything. Relief, hope, residual hurt, cautious optimism. The road ahead wasn't clear. We'd have more difficult conversations, more moments where old patterns tried to reassert themselves, more opportunities for both of us to choose differently than we had before. But for the first time in months, I felt something I'd almost forgotten. The possibility that love didn't have to mean suffering in silence, that relationships could be rebuilt on foundations of mutual respect rather than one-sided sacrifice, that maybe, just maybe, my son and I could find a way to be in each other's lives that didn't require me to disappear. The next morning, I woke to a text message from David, sent at 6 a.m. Had coffee this morning and thought of you. Remember how you used to make it so strong I said it could strip paint? I make mine the same way now. Funny what we carry with us without realizing it. I smiled at my phone. It was such a small thing. A text message, a memory about coffee, but it was more than I'd had yesterday, more than I'd dared hope for. I texted back, Your grandfather used to say good coffee should make you reconsider your life choices. I think he was onto something. 3 dots appeared, showing he was typing. Then, can I take you to breakfast this Sunday? Nowhere fancy. Just us? I'd like that, I replied. And I would. Not because it fixed everything. Not because one breakfast would undo months of pain and years of accumulated damage, but because it was a step. One small step towards something that might eventually become a relationship where we both got to be fully human. Flawed, complicated, worthy of respect, not because of what we could do for each other, but because of who we were to each other. I got ready for work that morning with something I hadn't felt in a long time: anticipation for what might come next. Not certainty. I was done expecting certainty from relationships, but genuine curiosity about what we might build together if we were both brave enough to keep choosing honesty over comfort, truth over pretense. The story wasn't over. Maybe it never would be, but at least now, for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was a character in it instead of just the backdrop against which someone else's story played out. And that, I was learning, made all the difference. Sunday morning arrived with the kind of golden light that makes ordinary moments feel significant. I dressed carefully, not to impress, but because this breakfast felt important in ways I couldn't quite articulate. David picked me up at 9, and for the first time in months, the silence in the car wasn't heavy with unspoken hurt. It was just silence. Comfortable, expectant, full of possibility. We went to a diner I'd taken him to when he was young, before life got complicated and money got tighter. The same red vinyl booths, the same laminated menus, the same smell of coffee and bacon that had always meant Sunday mornings and rare moments of rest. I can't believe this place is still here, David said as we slid into a booth by the window. Some things endure, I said with a small smile. We ordered pancakes for him, an omelet for me, and when the waitress walked away, David pulled something from his jacket pocket, an envelope, worn at the edges like it had been handled many times. I wrote you something too, he said, sliding it across the table. Not as eloquent as your letter, but I needed to put things in writing, to make sure I said everything properly. I opened it there, at the table, while he watched nervously. His handwriting was the same as it had been since high school, small, precise, controlled. But the words themselves were anything but controlled. Mom, it began, I've been trying to figure out when I stopped seeing you as a person and started seeing you as a function. When did my mother become synonymous with someone who exists to make my life easier? I've traced it back through memories, looking for the moment everything changed. And I think the truth is there wasn't one moment. It was 1,000 small moments where you said yes when you should have said no, where you gave when you should have kept, where you taught me that your needs didn't matter as much as mine. But here's what I'm realizing now. You taught me that because you believed it. And you believed it because your mother taught you the same thing. We've been passing down this terrible inheritance. This idea that women, mothers especially, are supposed to be infinite sources of love and support without requiring anything in return. I'm not making excuses for how I treated you, but I'm trying to understand it, to trace the roots of this damage so I don't keep repeating it. Because, Mom, I want children someday, and I need to learn how to love them without teaching them to take me for granted. I need to learn what you're learning now, that love without boundaries isn't love, it's just exhaustion disguised as virtue. Thank you for being brave enough to tell me the truth. Thank you for that letter, for coming to my office, for refusing to keep shrinking yourself to make me comfortable. You did what your mother couldn't. You broke the pattern before it was too late. And I'm grateful, even though my gratitude comes embarrassingly late. I had to stop reading because my eyes were too blurred with tears. When I looked up, David was crying too, not bothering to hide it. I talked to a therapist, he said quietly. Started going last week. I told her everything. About you, about Dad, about how I've been acting. She said something that hit me like a truck. She said, children who grow up watching their mothers sacrifice everything learn one of 2 lessons. Either they learn to value sacrifice, or they learn to expect it. And the difference between those 2 outcomes depends on whether the mother ever teaches them that she's human too. He reached across the table and took my hand. You tried to teach me, Mom, in 100 small ways over the years. But I wasn't listening because I didn't want to see you as someone with limits, with needs, with a life beyond me. It was easier to keep you in the box labeled mom, always available, always supportive, never requiring anything complicated from me. Our food arrived, and we ate slowly, continuing to talk between bites. He told me he'd reached out to Rachel, not to try to get back together, but to apologize for how he'd behaved. She'd agreed to meet him for coffee, told him she was glad he was getting help, but that she needed time before she could consider trusting him again. She was right to break up with me, he said. I was becoming my father without even realizing it. Someone who took the people who loved him for granted, who walked away when relationships required actual effort. You're not your father, I said firmly. Your father never questioned himself, never tried to understand his damage or fix it. You're doing the work. That's what matters. Will you come with me sometime? To therapy? He looked vulnerable asking it, younger than his years. Dr. Chen said it might help if we could have some sessions together, to talk through things with someone who can help us communicate better. I'd like that, I said, and I meant it. Not because I thought therapy would magically solve everything, but because it represented something important, his willingness to put in effort, to show up, to treat our relationship as something worth investing in rather than something he could take for granted. After breakfast, we drove to the park where I used to take him as a child. We walked the same paths we'd walked 20 years ago, when he'd been small enough to ride on my shoulders and the world had seemed simpler. Now we walked side by side, two adults trying to figure out how to be family to each other in a healthier way than we'd managed before. I need to tell you something, David said as we sat on a bench overlooking the pond. I've been thinking about Dad, about trying to find him. My stomach clenched. Why? Not to have a relationship with him. I don't want that. But I think I need to see him, to understand who he is, so I can understand which parts of me come from him and which parts I've chosen for myself. He looked at me. Would that hurt you, if I reached out to him? It was a fair question, and it deserved an honest answer. Yes, I said, it would hurt, but not because I think you shouldn't do it. It would hurt, because it would remind me of everything he took from us, from you. But David, you're an adult. If you need to meet him to make sense of your own story, I won't stand in your way. I don't know if I actually will, he admitted. Just knowing I could, that you wouldn't try to stop me, that's enough for now. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching ducks paddle across the pond, listening to children play on the distant playground. This was what I'd been missing, I realized. Not grand gestures or dramatic apologies, but simple presence. The quiet comfort of being with someone who saw you, who was trying to understand you, who was willing to sit with you even when there was nothing that needed saying. Mom? David's voice pulled me from my thoughts. Can I ask you something that might be hard to answer? Of course. Do you regret having me? Not in general, but in specifics. Do you regret the choices you made, the things you gave up, the life you could have had if I hadn't existed? I thought about it carefully, wanting to give him truth rather than platitudes. I regret that I had to make those choices alone, that your father didn't stay to share the burden. I regret that I didn't have more support, more resources, more options. But regret you? Never. Not even on the hardest days. Not even when I was exhausted and scared and didn't know how we'd make it through. How can you be sure? Because even when I'm angry at you, even when you hurt me, even when we're not speaking, I still wouldn't trade having known you for anything. You were never the problem, David. The circumstances were hard, and I didn't always handle them well, but you were never something I wished I could undo. He leaned his head on my shoulder the way he used to when he was small and the world felt overwhelming. I let him, and we sat like that until the sun shifted and the shadows changed, and eventually it was time to go home. Over the following months, things slowly changed between us. We had our therapy sessions. Sometimes difficult, often uncomfortable, always honest. We had Sunday breakfasts that became a regular thing, a standing appointment that neither of us canceled unless absolutely necessary. He started calling just to talk, not because he needed something, but because he wanted to hear my voice. He met Patricia one Sunday when she happened to be outside as he was dropping me off. They talked for 20 minutes about her garden, and I watched him be genuinely interested, genuinely present, in a way I hadn't seen him be with anyone in years. She's good for you, he said later. I'm glad you have her. I'm glad I do too, I agreed. I'm learning that it's okay to need people, to let them in, to build a life that doesn't revolve entirely around being your mother. He smiled, but there was sadness in it. I'm sorry it took me being terrible for you to learn that. Maybe that's just how it goes sometimes, I said. We break things to learn how to build them better. One evening in late spring, almost a year after that terrible birthday, David called and asked if he could come over. When he arrived, he had someone with him, Rachel. They weren't holding hands, but there was something in the way they stood next to each other that suggested they were figuring things out, taking it slow, trying to rebuild what had been broken. Rachel wanted to meet you properly, David said. Not at some stuffy dinner party where I was being an ass, but actually meet you. We sat in my living room, the three of us, and talked for hours. Rachel asked about my work, about my book club, about my mother's letters. She shared her own story about watching her grandmother diminish herself for family members who never appreciated it, about her fear that she'd repeat that pattern if she wasn't vigilant. David told me about your letter, she said, about everything you wrote to him. I know it's not my place, but I wanted to tell you how brave I think that was. To tell the truth even when the truth was hard, even when you didn't know how he'd react. It was the scariest thing I've ever done, I admitted. Scarier than raising him alone, scarier than any of the hard years, because at least during those years I had him. Writing that letter meant risking losing him completely. But you did it anyway, David said quietly. You chose truth over comfort. That's what changed everything. Before they left that night, Rachel hugged me. Thank you, she whispered, for raising someone who was willing to do the hard work of becoming better. Not everyone is. After they'd gone, I stood in my quiet house and realized something profound. I was happy, not deliriously, perfectly happy. Life was still hard. Money was still tight. I still worried about the future, but I was fundamentally, genuinely happy in a way I couldn't remember being before. Because for the first time, my happiness wasn't dependent on someone else's approval or presence. It was mine, built from the ground up, rooted in my own worth rather than what I could do for others. I thought about my mother's letters, about the patterns we'd both fallen into, about the legacy of silence and sacrifice that had shaped generations of women in our family. And I thought about how I'd finally broken that cycle. Not perfectly, not easily, but definitively. On my next birthday, David showed up at my door with a cake he'd baked himself. It was lopsided and the frosting was messy, but "Happy Birthday, Mom" was written across it in careful letters. It's not as good as yours, he said with a sheepish smile. But I wanted to make it myself this time, to show you that I see the work you put in all those years, that I don't take it for granted anymore. We ate cake at my kitchen table, and he told me stories about work and Rachel and the therapy sessions he was still attending. He asked about my week, really asked, and listened to my answers with genuine interest. Before he left, he handed me an envelope. Inside was a check. Not a huge amount, but enough to cover several months of the mortgage payments I'd been struggling with. This isn't charity, he said when I tried to protest. This is me paying back a tiny fraction of what you invested in me. You gave me everything, Mom. Let me give you something back. I cried as I hugged him, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of being seen, being valued, being loved not just as a mother, but as a person deserving of care and consideration. I love you, he said against my shoulder. I'm sorry it took me so long to show it properly. I love you too, I whispered back, and I'm proud of who you're becoming. As I watched him drive away that night, I understood something I'd been circling around for months. This was what justice looked like. Not revenge, not punishment, not even the dramatic apology I'd once imagined I needed. Just this. A son who'd learned to see his mother as human, who'd done the hard work of examining his own behavior and choosing to change it, who showed up not just when it was convenient but consistently, intentionally, with genuine care. I'd spent so many years believing that love meant suffering in silence, but I'd learned something better, that real love requires honesty, boundaries, and the courage to demand respect, even from the people who've known us longest. That being a good mother didn't mean disappearing into the role, but showing my son what it looked like to be a whole person, flawed, struggling, worthy of care and consideration. My mother's letters had started this journey. My letter to David had continued it. But the real change came from the daily choice to show up as myself, not just as someone's mother, but as Alice. A woman with needs and limits and dreams of her own. A woman who'd learned, finally, that her worth didn't depend on how much she could sacrifice, but on the simple fact of her existence. And that, I'd discovered, was more than enough.